Bitterroot Valley, Montana, August 1871. The air was thick with the scent of pine sawdust and the rhythmic thud of axes biting into timber. All around the valley floor, settlers were racing the coming autumn, raising the skeletons of new cabins before the first snows flew, all except one. On a gentle rise overlooking the river, Lukas Aebi was not felling trees. He wasn't sawing planks or hewing logs. He was moving rocks. With a quiet, methodical rhythm, he worked within the footprint of 4 crumbling stone walls, the forgotten remnants of an old fur trading post abandoned decades ago. The walls were low, barely shoulder high, but they were immensely thick, a full 2 feet of river stone and ancient powdery mortar. To the other men, it was a ruin, a place to be scavenged for a hearthstone or two before being forgotten again. To Lukas, it was a foundation. Grant Hollis, the settlement's most respected carpenter, stopped his work to watch. He leaned on his broadaxe, the polished wood warm from his hands. With him were 2 other homesteaders, Silas Croft and Jebediah Kane, their faces etched with the practical skepticism of the frontier. They saw Aebi clearing brush, prying out loose stones, and mixing a mud and straw mortar in a shallow pit. It was slow, heavy, pointless work. "That's a week's labor for no good reason, Lukas," Hollis finally called out, his voice carrying easily in the clear air. His authority was unquestioned. He had built nearly half the structures in their corner of the valley. A proper cabin takes half the time. Those stones will just suck the heat right out of you. Pure foolishness. Kane grunted in agreement. "It's a tomb you're building, Aebi. It'll be colder inside than out come January." Lukas Aebi paused, wiping a sleeve across his forehead. He looked at the massive stones, then at the tall, straight lodgepole pines destined for Hollis's cabins. He was a man of few words, his English still carrying the heavy, melodic cadence of his native Swiss German. He offered a simple, cryptic response that only deepened their confusion. "The stone remembers the sun," he said, and turned back to his work, fitting a heavy granite boulder into a gap in the wall. The sound of its grating finality was his only further argument. The men shook their heads. The Swiss was mad. In a land of endless timber, he was choosing to live inside a pile of rocks. What did this Swiss mason, a man who knew the deep, abiding cold of the Alps, understand about the physics of thermal mass that the finest frontier carpenters, masters of wood and speed, had completely missed? The answer lies not in cleverness, but in a different understanding of time, temperature, and the very definition of shelter. We are going to explore the forgotten science of thermal mass, a principle so powerful it can turn a stone wall into a furnace. I promise that by the end of this story, you will understand how simple thickness can defeat the most brutal cold. Before we delve into that, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell for more stories of frontier ingenuity. And let us know in the comments, what is the coldest temperature you have ever experienced? Lukas Aebi was not a frontiersman. He was not a hunter, a trapper, or even a farmer by trade. He was a Steinmetz, a stonemason, from the high valleys of Graubünden, Switzerland. His hands were not trained to the axe or the plow, but to the hammer and the chisel. He understood the world through the grain of granite, the cleavage of slate, and the heft of limestone. His entire life had been spent among objects of immense weight and permanence. The 3-foot-thick walls of alpine chalets designed to bear the weight of 10 feet of snow, the massive tiled Kachelofen stoves that could heat a home for a full day on a single load of wood, the carefully laid stone foundations that anchored buildings to the mountainside for centuries. He thought in terms of tons, not pounds, of decades, not seasons. He had come to America with his wife Anya, and their 2 small children, Emil and Sophie, seeking land and opportunity. What they found in their first Montana winter of 1870 was a different kind of cold than they had ever known. The alpine cold was deep and still, a thing to be walled out with mass. The Montana cold was a living predator. It was carried on a relentless wind that found every crack, every seam, every nail hole in the standard plank cabin they had hastily purchased. That first winter was a lesson in misery. The wind, a constant whining pressure from the north, cut through the thin wooden walls as if they were muslin. Anya spent her days stuffing rags and moss into the chinks, a futile battle against an invisible siege. They burned wood at a terrifying rate, the small iron stove glowing red hot, yet its heat seemed to vanish inches from its surface. The air in the single room was a landscape of its own, with a stiflingly hot ceiling and a floor so cold that water spilled on it would glaze over with ice. By midnight, the fire would inevitably die down. The battle lost for the night. They would crawl into their beds fully clothed, piling every blanket and animal hide they owned on top of them. In the morning, they would wake to see their own breath misting in the air and a delicate, cruel filigree of frost coating the heads of the nails on the interior walls, each one a tiny thermal bridge conducting the killing cold directly into their living space. Anya developed a deep, rattling cough that lingered for months. The children were always cold, their faces pale, and their movements sluggish. Lukas, a man who had felt he understood cold, felt helpless. He had failed his family. He vowed it would not happen again. He would not fight the cold with the flimsy weapon of wood. He would fight it with the one thing he truly understood: stone. The failure of the conventional frontier cabin was not a failure of craftsmanship. Grant Hollis was an excellent carpenter. His joints were tight, his planks were true. The failure was one of physics. The structures he and others built were perfectly designed for the temperate climates from which their designs originated, but they were tragically mismatched for the brutal energy dynamics of a high plains winter. The central problem was a near total lack of thermal mass. A standard 1-inch pine board has an R value, a measure of its resistance to heat flow, of about 1. A typical frontier cabin wall, with its single layer of planks, offered little more protection than a heavy coat. The vast reservoir of heat generated by the wood stove, a torrent of British thermal units, or BTUs, had nowhere to go. It heated the air in the cabin, and that superheated air immediately began a desperate search for a way out. It leaked through the roof, the floor, and most dramatically, it conducted straight through the thin wooden walls into the infinitely cold outdoors. The moment the fire was no longer being fed, the cabin's temperature began to plummet. It was a bucket with 1,000 holes. Keeping it full required a constant, exhausting torrent of fuel. For the families in the Bitterroot Valley, this meant winter was a siege. Life contracted to a small circle around the stove. The corners of the room were effectively uninhabitable. Chores were a frantic dash from one zone of relative warmth to another. The primary winter labor for every able-bodied man was the felling, bucking, and splitting of wood. It was a tyrant. A family might burn through 15 or 20 cords of wood in a single winter. A small forest, sacrificed for a few months of tenuous survival. The Hollis family, like all their neighbors, slept in shifts on the coldest nights. One person always awake to feed the hungry stove, a sentry posted against the encroaching cold. This was the accepted reality of the frontier, a hardship to be endured with grim fortitude. It was simply the way things were. Lukas Aebi began his work in earnest. The 4 standing walls formed a rough rectangle about 20 feet by 30. The stones were immense, worn smooth by the river and time, locked together with a mortar that had long since turned to dust in many places. His first task was foundational. For 2 weeks, he used a lever and fulcrum to pry out the loosest stones at the base, digging a shallow trench and refilling it with a solid new course of the largest boulders he could move, locking them in place with his dense mixture of clay, sand, and dried grass. He wasn't just patching the wall, he was giving it a solid anchor to the earth. The community watched with a mixture of pity and amusement. Their mockery was not malicious. It was the honest bewilderment of practical men seeing a violation of every principle they knew. "You're building on a ruin, Aebi," Hollis advised him one afternoon, gesturing at the mottled, uneven walls. "It'd be faster to knock it all down and start fresh with logs." "The work is already done," Lukas replied, his hands covered in wet clay as he forced it deep into a crevice. 100 years ago? Hollis shook his head, shifting to his primary, economic objection. "Even if you get it to stand, think of the wood you'll need to heat that much stone. It's a heat sink. It will draw the warmth out of that room faster than you can make it. You'll never be warm. You'll freeze, and you'll have wasted the entire summer on it." Lukas stood up and placed a hand on the sun-drenched western wall. The stone was warm, almost hot to the touch. "The heat will stay," he said, his voice quiet but certain. He then returned to his work, leaving Hollis to stare at the back of a man who simply would not listen to reason. His wife, Anya, was more private in her concerns. She watched him labor from dawn until dusk, his body stained with the earth, his hands raw. The structure taking shape did not look like a house. "It looks like a hill, Lukas," she said one evening, her voice gentle. There was trust in her eyes, but also a flicker of the fear that remembered the frost on the nails. "A very sturdy hill." "Hills are warm in the winter," he answered, "if you are inside them." Once the walls were solid and chinked, rising to a uniform height of 8 feet, he began the roof. He did not saw planks. Instead, he laid thick lodgepole pine rafters across the span, and on top of them, a heavy layer of willow branches and prairie grass. Finally, he enlisted Anya and the children to help him haul buckets of earth, covering the entire roof with a foot-thick layer of sod. By the time he was finished, the structure looked less like a cabin and more like a part of the landscape, a low, grassy mound with a single door and 2 small, deep-set windows. Inside, he built a large but simple stone hearth and chimney against the north wall, integrating it directly into the massive structure. The mockery from his neighbors lasted all summer. The validation, he knew, would last all winter. To understand what Lukas Aebi had built, you have to understand the principle of thermal mass. It is a concept entirely different from insulation. Insulation is about resistance, slowing the passage of heat. Thermal mass is about absorption, storing heat. Think of it like the difference between a dam and a sponge. A thin wooden wall is a poor dam. Heat flows right through it. A thick stone wall is a giant sponge. It soaks up heat energy and holds it for a very long time. Let's use the numbers of the frontier. A pound of dry pine, when burned, releases about 8,000 British thermal units, BTUs, of energy. A typical Franklin stove of the era might burn 5 pounds of wood an hour, releasing 40,000 BTUs into the cabin. In Grant Hollis's cabin, with its thin walls, perhaps 90% of that heat was lost within the hour, radiating out into the minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit air. The cabin was a constant energy hemorrhage. Now consider Lukas Aebi's home. The walls he had fortified were 2 feet thick, a conservative estimate of their total weight, along with the sod roof and earthen floor, was over 150 tons. That's 300,000 pounds of material. Stone and earth have a high specific heat capacity, meaning it takes a lot of energy to raise their temperature. All day long, as Lukas ran a modest fire, a significant portion of the 40,000 BTUs per hour was not just heating the air, it was flowing directly into the walls like water pouring into a vast empty reservoir. The sun, striking the south and west-facing walls, added thousands more BTUS to the thermal bank account. By nightfall, the equation flipped. Outside, the temperature plummeted. Inside a conventional cabin, the indoor temperature would chase it downwards. But inside the Aebi home, the physics were entirely different. As the air in the room began to cool, it dropped below the temperature of the massive walls. The heat flow reversed. The 150-ton sponge, saturated with the day's energy, now began to slowly release it back into the living space. The walls themselves became a gentle, silent, radiant heater. Lukas had not built a simple barrier against the cold. He had built a heat battery, a thermal flywheel that smoothed out the violent temperature swings between day and night. He was storing the warmth of noon to spend it at the stroke of midnight. That December, the valley fell into the grip of a brutal, generational cold snap. For 16 consecutive nights, the mercury did not rise above -15 degrees Fahrenheit. The air grew so cold and dense that sound carried for miles, and the pop of a freezing tree trunk echoed like a rifle shot. It was a dry, windless, penetrating cold that found its way past every defense. It was the perfect test. For the settlers in their wooden cabins, it was an ordeal. Life became a primal struggle for warmth. Inside Grant Hollis's expertly built home, the family lived in a state of siege. The wood box, stacked high each evening, was nearly empty by dawn. Every piece of metal in the house was dangerously cold to the touch. Ice formed in a thick, opaque sheet on the inside of the windows, blocking what little light the winter sun offered. The family huddled together on the warmest patch of floor near the stove, wrapped in blankets, their faces flushed from the direct heat while their backs remained chilled. Sleep was fitful, punctuated by the roar of the fire and the constant anxiety of it dying out. The scene inside the Aebi home was from another world. During the day, Lukas kept a small, steady fire going in the hearth, more for cooking and light than for desperate heat. The air in the room was still and quiet. There were no drafts. As evening fell, he would let the fire burn down to a bed of glowing coals, banking them with ash to last the night. And then there was only silence. The miracle was in the mundane. Anya found she could work on her mending in a chair in the far corner of the room, her fingers remaining nimble and quick. On the small wooden table, a pat of butter left out from dinner remained soft and spreadable in the morning. The sound that filled the small home was not the whistle of the wind or the crackle of a ravenous fire, but the deep, even breathing of their children, Emil and Sophie, sleeping soundly under a single wool blanket. The smell of the herbs Anya had hung from the rafters still filled the air, a scent of summer preserved against the frozen world outside. The contrast was absolute, and it could be measured. Outside the Hollis cabin, the temperature was -22 degrees Fahrenheit. By morning, with the fire reduced to embers, the temperature inside had fallen to a miserable 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside the Aebi home, the temperature was also -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, with no new fire since the previous evening, the air temperature had stabilized at a comfortable 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The visual proof was just as stark. The ice on Hollis's window pane was a solid, sightless cataract. On the Aebi's small, deep-set window, only a delicate fringe of frost traced the bottom edge of the glass, a mere nod to the brutal cold held at bay. The stone was doing its work. The mass was holding the warmth. The memory of the sun was keeping them safe. The breaking point for Grant Hollis came on the 10th day of the cold snap. In the brittle pre-dawn light, he discovered one of his young calves had panicked and broken through a fence rail. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped his face in wool, and set out after it, his boots crunching on the crystalline snow. The cold was a physical presence, searing his lungs with every breath. He tracked the calf for half a mile, the chase leading him toward the strange, low hillock that was the Aebi property. The animal, confused and terrified, scrambled along the edge of the clearing where the stone house sat, a plume of steam jetting from its nostrils. Hollis, gasping for breath, his beard a solid mass of ice, stumbled in the deep snow. He threw out a hand to steady himself, his bare palm slapping hard against the southern wall of Lukas Aebi's home. His mind braced for the expected shock, the sharp, biting pain of flesh meeting frozen stone, a cold that felt like a burn. He expected his skin to stick, to have the heat sucked from his hand in an instant. But the shock never came. What he felt was so profoundly wrong, so contrary to every law of winter as he knew it, that he froze. The stone was not cold. It wasn't warm either, not like a hearthstone. It was a deep, resonant neutrality. It was the absence of cold. Against the searing -20 degrees Fahrenheit air, this profound lack of bite felt like a powerful, living warmth. He slowly, deliberately, pressed his entire palm flat against the rough surface of a large granite boulder. The stone was giving back the ghost of yesterday's fire, the memory of the afternoon sun. It was breathing heat. He stood there for a full minute, the frantic calf forgotten, his bare hand pressed against the impossible wall. The cold air knifed at his back, but the stone before him was a silent, powerful testament to a truth he had refused to see. He finally understood. Later that morning, a humbled Grant Hollis knocked on Lukas Aebi's door. When Lukas opened it, the carpenter was hit not by a blast of heat, but by a wall of calm, even warmth, a stillness that felt almost sacred. His eyes scanned the room. He saw the children playing on a rug on the floor, their coats nowhere in sight. He saw Anya kneading dough on the table, her sleeves rolled up. And then he saw it, the final, irrefutable proof. Sitting on the floor near the interior wall, a few feet from where his own hand had rested on the outside, was a wooden bucket of water. "Your water bucket," Hollis said, his voice raspy. "There's no ice on it." In his own cabin, a bucket that far from the stove would have been frozen solid in an hour. Lukas Aebi simply nodded, his expression calm, without a hint of triumph. "The stone holds the warmth," he said. Grant Hollis, the master carpenter, the expert on shelter, looked at the massive, unadorned walls. He saw not a crude pile of rocks, but a machine of elegant and profound design. He finally found the words, his voice full of a new and sudden awe. "My God, Aebi," he said, meeting the mason's gaze. "You didn't build a house, you built a hearth." The conversion of Grant Hollis was as powerful as the winter cold. He became the innovation's most fervent advocate. He was the valley's expert, and his word carried weight. When men came to him for advice on building, he would point them toward the low, grassy mound on the hill. "Go talk to the Swiss mason first," he'd say. "Wood moves fast. It's for the parts that don't matter. For the part that keeps your family alive, you need stone." The idea, proven so dramatically, began to spread. It was a form of architectural evolution driven by the harsh pressures of survival. That next spring, settlers began incorporating Lukas Aebi's principles into their own structures. Few had access to an abandoned fort, so they adapted. They began building their new cabins with a hybrid design, 3 walls of conventional log or plank, but the long north wall, the one that faced the bitter winter wind, they built 2 feet thick with fieldstone, mortared with clay. They called it an Aebi wall. It became a verb in the valley. "We're going to Aebi the north side this year." The results were immediate and transformative. By 1875, just 4 years after Lukas roofed his ruin, over a dozen homesteads in the valley had incorporated thick wall construction. Families reported a dramatic change in their quality of life. The constant, exhausting labor of feeding the stove was lessened. Fuel consumption reports, gathered informally at the general store, showed that families with an Aebi wall were using nearly 40% less wood through the winter. The idea spread not through blueprints or books, but through direct observation and word of mouth, the most reliable currency of the frontier. It spread because it worked. What Lukas Aebi accomplished with ancient knowledge and intuition, modern building science would later formalize with complex calculations and terminology. Architects today speak of passive solar design, of using a building's orientation and materials to capture and store the sun's energy. They design trombe walls and thermal flywheels, using mass to buffer the occupants from extreme external temperatures. Lukas Aebi, with his ancestral understanding of how stone behaves in the high Alps, had built a near-perfect passive structure by instinct. He demonstrated a principle of sustainable design that would be largely forgotten in the coming century of cheap fuel and powerful central heating, only to be rediscovered by engineers in an age of energy consciousness. His simple, sturdy hill was a century ahead of its time. There is a philosophy embedded in that stone wall, a lesson about time and energy. A thin wooden wall exists only in the present moment. It fights the cold of this minute, battling the ceaseless outflow of heat. When the fire dies, its defense collapses instantly. It surrenders. A thin wall has no memory. The thick stone wall that Lukas Aebi built operates on an entirely different timeline. It is a bridge across time. It absorbs the superfluous heat of the afternoon and generously gives it back to the deep, freezing hours of the night. It takes the warmth from yesterday and carries it safely into tomorrow. The frontier prized speed, the quick felling of trees, the rapid raising of a cabin. It was a culture of the immediate. But Lukas Aebi, the quiet outsider, proved that true. Lasting survival sometimes required the opposite. It required slowness, deliberation, depth, and mass. He didn't just build a shelter to keep the cold out, he built a structure that transformed the very nature of time, smoothing the brutal peaks and valleys of a Montana winter into a gentle, livable, and enduring wave. If you found this exploration of thermal mass and frontier ingenuity valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. The history of human survival is filled with forgotten knowledge. What other ingenious, low-tech building techniques have you heard about? Share them with our community in the comments below. We read everyone. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Anyone attempting to apply these or other historical building methods today should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all modern building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.